1.
In my humble opinion, I just think black people complain too much. They whine about everything. Every time I look up, there's another African American complaining about something. Why can't you all just be happy?
To some degree, you're right. Looking back at American history, I guess you can consider people of color big complainers about their current position. We complain about being enslaved. We complain about Jim Crow laws. We complain about a lack of economic opportunity. We complain about not being able to vote. We complain about our unequal and underfunded education system. I guess you can call Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. one of the biggest complainers from the African American community. You see, whenever the status quo is persistently being challenged by underrepresented communities, the undertones of legitimate complaints can be construed as complaining by the majority because it disrupts the current social climate that favors the majority. Take again the NFL protests, anthem protests. My white brother who finds the protests disgusting and disgraceful to America is speaking from a favorable and privileged position, who can empathize with the protesters because he is coming from a completely different American experience. You see, the flag is not a static symbol that has only one meaning. To one group of people, they associate being an American with acceptance and opportunity, and to another group of people, disenfranchisement and marginalization are associated with the American experience. Rebuttal number 2.
Honestly, I just think black people want everything done for them. They just want handouts and have no work ethic. I think they're lazy.
While there are definitely some in the African American community who abuse the welfare system and have no desire to work, they are by no means representative of the whole. Just as a white person who may say something like this is not representative of all white people. With that said, the reason we say there is systemic and institutional racial bias is because the problems are much deeper than just an unwillingness to work. If there were equal educational opportunities, equal employment access, equal housing infrastructure in certain areas, then the person may have something. Rebuttal number 3.
Why do black people always have to play the race card? Does everything have to be about race?
America has played the race card ever since European Americans made their way over here. The race card was played against the Native Americans. It was played against my people when it came to slavery. It was played when our vote counted as 3/5 of a full vote. It was played even when slavery was over and when our skin color prevented us from getting jobs, adequate housing, fairness in the justice system. The race card was played with separate but equal, sitting in the back of buses, and the inability to vote. The race card has been the foundation of American society for hundreds of years. We are arguing that the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should not be based on race, but it should be a right of every American. Rebuttal number 4.
African Americans need to focus on their own community since you all are killing each other.
It is true that black on black crime is a serious issue and there's no justification for the crime and homicides that inundates our communities. But to turn your nose up and dismiss the black community as just savages who kill and rob one another is to ignore the problems that compound and instigate crime in the community. As one writer said, this needs to be treated as a public health issue because of the social factors that feed into the violence. A lack of social and institutional services for the community, a lack of employment, and neighborhood segregation prevents us from looking at black on black crime in a vacuum. This is an easy distraction. Black on black crime, when people say it's black on black crime and try to dismiss the major issues, it's an easy distraction by some who like to use it as a pretext to ignore the larger systemic issues that correspond to the violence. The term black on black crime is also ridiculous because it presumes crimes committed against one's own people group are mostly restricted to the African American population. Gary Young wrote about this and alluded to America's segregation as leading to the high proportion of crimes being committed by those of the same ethnicity. For example, he mentioned that 84% of white people who are killed every year are killed by white people. And lastly, there is a difference between crimes committed by black people against black people and crimes committed by the state against black people. As Michael Eric Dyson pointed out, black people who kill black people go to jail. But when a crime is committed by the state against black people, generally, not in every case, but what seems to be the environment is that that person who committed that, who works for the state, committed that against a black person, continues their job with impunity. Rebuttal number 5.
I mean, honestly, shouldn't black people just be happy they're not slaves anymore?
Rebuttal number 6.
I think African Americans need to just forgive what happened in the past and move on. Being bitter never solved anything.
The person who says this is the same person who thinks black people are complaining when they decry racial injustice. A false equivalency has been created in this person's mind to equate a letting go of the past with an absence of lasting repercussions of the past that links to our present. While I am a major proponent of forgiveness, to think that that somehow mitigates the endemic consequences of slavery and flat-out racism against blacks over the past 200 years is naive. One of the best analogies I heard on systemic and racial injustice against people of color came from a white guy from a church I used to go to. And he said, imagine if you're playing a game of Monopoly. You're playing a game of Monopoly. And while we were playing, you noticed that I was cheating. And the property and money that I accumulated through that, you called me out for cheating throughout the game for the amount that I had. So you called me out and you told me to stop cheating. And I said, all right. You caught me. I cheated. I'm sorry. I won't cheat anymore. Now you can forgive me, right? Clearly you can forgive me for cheating. But the problem is all of the gain that I made from cheating, and it was still in my possession. And while I said I'm not going to cheat anymore, I still have an unfair advantage in the game because moving forward, I have the property that I have because of me cheating. And you can argue that you were never put in a fair position to win, and in reality, you weren't because of how the game was rigged. In a similar way, people of color have been cheated ever since we came to this country hundreds of years ago. From slavery to Jim Crow, to education, housing, and employment discrimination, equality always has been elusive for African Americans. And the irreparable damages caused by unjust practices have placed a lot of African Americans in a perpetual condition of need and lack. Take the city where I currently live, for instance, Chicago. Love the city. But Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in America. And for the most part, it's by design. When blacks moved up here from the South during the Great Migration, an exodus of whites soon followed. For African Americans who wanted a piece of their own American dream and become homeowners, they learned the hard way that as much as they try to pursue their own happiness, they are reminded that the pigment of their skin is a major impediment. White homeowners who would pose as real estate agents would sell their houses on contract to African Americans, which essentially amounted to 100% liability and 0% equity. Redlining began taking its ugly form by preventing mostly black populated areas from receiving housing insurance and confining blacks to a certain area in which they were stuck in. When whites left because of the influx of blacks, so were the jobs and the economic vitality of the neighborhood. 50 years later, and we see the suffocating consequences of discrimination. We see dilapidated infrastructure, dilapidated housing infrastructure, and within the community, under-resourced schools, low-quality food options, low job opportunities. When we hear about people of color living at or below the poverty line, we have to look at the societal issues that contribute to their conditions. For example, why is Joe struggling to survive? We use Joe as an example. I don't know Joe personally, so it's just an example. So why is Joe struggling to survive? Well, he can't get a decent paying job. Why can't he get a decent paying job? Because he's unqualified. Well, why is Joe unqualified? Because he doesn't have the education or skills for the job. Why doesn't he have the education or skills for the job? Well, because Joe couldn't finish high school because he had to get a job to support his family. And we can keep going deeper and deeper until we see the cyclical consequences of being subjected to environments that offer little hope that is passed from one generation to the next. Now, although some issues may be self-induced, I'm definitely not taking away personal responsibility by any means. We're responsible for our actions. And if we commit a crime, we deserve to pay. But when we're talking about, again, on a large scale, and we're talking about communities and people group that's been subjected to these type of environments for hundreds of years, then we start to look deeper. For example, if Joe's father is incarcerated because of drug charges and received a long and disproportionate sentence, then that will clearly impact Joe and his family. Not only that, but Joe lives in a block where it is common and very likely that residents will end up in prison. This is exactly how $1 million blocks are built. Please click the link. Actually, I don't think you can click this link because I need to be connected to a YouTube website or something. I don't know. I haven't uploaded a video on YouTube in a while, so I don't think you can click this link, but I have links in the description to a lot of what I'm saying. So please read not just this article, but a lot of things that I'm saying. The Washington Post posted an excellent article on $1 million blocks where in certain cities it is costing taxpayers more than $1 million to foot the incarceration bill. I'll take again my city, Chicago, which the focal point of this article was on Chicago. Again, I love Chicago. So many different cultures, beautiful city. But again, it's very segregated. Example right here, look at this map. This is directly from the article. The map is broken up into blocks, and the red identifies prison sentences for residents of that block. The darker the red, the higher the incarcerations from that area. Needless to say, the area in the bottom left is the west side of Chicago and predominantly black, with North Chicago being predominantly white. The reason this article is so good is because it addresses the burden of the current prison system on the society as a whole. The writer asks, and I quote, "What if we spent $2.2 million not removing residents from the corner of West Madison and Cicero, but investing in the people there? What if we spent that money on preschool and summer jobs programs and education treatment? Evidence suggests that such investments could do more to deter crime than locking people away." You can read the other article this journalist also wrote that refers to this evidence and of how violent crime arrests went down when the city offered summer jobs to high-risk youth in Chicago. The point of all this is, while I am an advocate, like I said again, an advocate of personal responsibility and criminals should be punished, how the city, state, and even the country addresses these types of issues intentionally or unintentionally boils down to our skin color. The measures taken to address widespread social problems have a distinct racial flavor to them, and it reflects America's attitudes towards them, towards us, towards the people group. Another example, drugs in America. This is a prime example. We're currently in the drug crisis, the opioid crisis. During the Nixon administration, and this actually was compounded by the Reagan administration, the war on drugs, which all of us are familiar with, that slogan that was made popular during that time, war on drugs, war on drugs. Well, it was an aggressive federal campaign to punish users of crack cocaine. The crackdown inevitably led to large numbers of African Americans incarcerated with excessive sentences, very excessive sentences. Fast forward to today. Again, we're in a different drug crisis, and the users, and the majority users, are much different as well. America is now faced with an opioid crisis where most of the deaths associated with it come from the white population. USA Today reports that of all the deaths in 2015 from opioid and heroin overdoses nationwide, 90% of the people were white, when in the 70s and 80s, the drug crisis was considered a societal pandemic that corroded the good nature of America. The opioid crisis is considered a public health issue where doctors and elected officials are trying to think of good and practical ways to curb the abuse. And again, during the Reagan administration and this whole war on drugs, the African American was pummeled, I would say, just by the aggressiveness of the sentencing for users, sellers of the drug. And so the black population was heavily impacted by this. And so the response by the government on the time, again, was severe sentences for the drug offenders And with the current drug crisis, I'm contrasting with the current drug crisis now that affects the mostly white population. The response from society is now town hall meetings to discuss the issue. And it's more than town hall meetings, clearly, but the contrast is stark, very stark. While the African Americans were criminalized by the government and society and viewed as lawless felons who deserved to be in prison, the white population that suffers from opioid abuse is seen as helpless Americans who need rehabilitation and support from society. I'm going to make this even more clear. When a public health issue negatively impacts the African American community, American society ignores it. But when it affects the white population, all hands are on deck to try to constructively and efficiently address the problem. So to bring all this full circle, with the original prompt of the NFL protests, those who are railing against the athletes for not respecting the flag have every right to do so. And to some degree, I understand how some may feel offended when someone takes a knee or raises a fist during the anthem. Again, I support the protest, but I understand. I understand why some people have take issue with it. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to invite the other person who disagrees with me to understand our side, this side, so let's understand each other. But again, just to summarize and bring this to a close, it seems like this issue is divided among racial lines, as I said in the beginning, because it is divided among racial lines and the different experiences between blacks and whites. The black and white experience in America as a whole has been and continues to be vastly different. And our different experiences are manifesting itself in the way most whites find it disgusting for players to kneel, and the way most blacks identify and support the symbolic protest. The irony and hypocrisy, though, there is a level of hypocrisy in this whole thing, is that some people have been so caught up in honoring the flag, which is symbolic for freedom and equality, that they disparage those and belittle those who want to uphold the true meaning of the flag and protest for equality and what America is supposed to stand for. This is the same irony and hypocrisy shown at one time by America to African American war veterans when they returned home from war. These patriots were fighting for America overseas, yet America did not fight for them when they returned home. They returned home to second-class citizenship, discrimination, and hostility because of the color of their skin. It didn't matter that they exuded the highest form of patriotism by fighting for the country. As Eric Mason, who was a pastor out in Philadelphia, Church of Philadelphia, he said so succinctly, each version of the American flag was created in eras when blacks weren't equal, and we honored it. We are just waiting for it to honor us. Rebuttal number 7. If blacks don't like the way America is, then they should just leave the country. If you don't like America, then get out. Go on, get. I stated in the previous video already that I love living in this country, and I'm sure the majority of African Americans would rather live here than in another country, honestly. But the person who says this in response to complaints by African Americans about inequality and racial injustice suggests that inequality and racial injustice is something that we should expect from living here. And if we don't like it, then we should leave. The person is immediately offended at the thought that America can do wrong and that he or she doesn't even hear or understand the legitimate complaints. In their minds, America is a utopia of freedom, opportunity, and unrivaled living conditions. And they are so blinded by disproportionate favoritism this country shows them that they cannot empathize with the underprivileged sector. Now, it will be different if the complaints are about secondary issues that's a matter of preference, like, America doesn't have enough, cricket teams or Chilean soup or whatever, if that's the case, then maybe you may want to go somewhere where they have more of that, I don't know. But, when we're talking about literal life and death issues, that's, and for most people just, oppressive conditions, then there's a reason to complain to the powers that be. Not to mention that America is a country that explicitly declares its foundation to be that of freedom, opportunity, and equality. So it's not like blacks are protesting for a new world order or, for a complete overthrow of the government, or government proper. Some may want to overthrow this particular government, this administration, but that's another story for another day. But, the point is that we actually want to experience the fullness of opportunity and freedom that many whites experience. And lastly, I think it's just kind of selfish for people to say something like this when they're speaking from their own personal American experience. Just because you've managed to live a good life in this country doesn't mean things are as good for others. So let's have some empathy and seek to understand what can make this country better. Rebuttal number 8. God is colorblind, so it's counterproductive to talk about racial tensions in the church. Only Christ matters. Is God colorblind? Okay, one hand, yes, you could say that. Because when God judges us, our ethnicity will do absolutely nothing for us when it comes to getting into heaven. Not that, being white or being black or being whatever you are is going to give you an extra leg up. God shows no partiality. He is no respecter of person, so that has nothing to do with anything. But on the other hand, by virtue of the fact that God created us differently, with different skin colors, different hair types, different languages, etc., etc., it means that God cares and loves individuals of various kinds. That also means God cares. If God cares about it, then we probably should too. And now I've been in majority white churches before, and where they made it clear that I was a minority, not in a good way. And I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe some of the jokes and some of the things that were said were not intentionally meant to hurt, but nonetheless, I know when I'm a black person, in a majority white church, not in every case, but I've experienced that. Also, I think when it comes to politics, just remember, Jesus is not Republican or Democrat. He's not liberal or conservative. We can't make these labels and expect Jesus to fit neatly in there. I've seen many Christians judge others harshly for not voting a certain way or having a certain political opinion, or a different political opinion than them. And that's just not right. And I also want to say, this is not a reflection, on the church that I go to now. On the contrary, I really enjoy the church where I'm at, downtown Chicago. Shout out to Holy Trinity, John Dennis, everybody else holding it down. Do a good job with trying to just really not just address these racial issues and in a gospel-oriented way, but even the making inroads in the church to add more diversity in that is beautiful. And so if there are predominant white churches struggling with having conversations about racial tensions, about things that happen nationally that involve white or blacks or any other racial tension conversations, that I would just repeat what Eric Mason, again a pastor out in Philadelphia, said, which is a beautiful word of wisdom. Talking about race and injustice shouldn't divide the church. Ignoring it does.